No, stop. Okay, it's not working. Okay, just stop. Okay? We're not doing this. So we're going to put you back there. We're not doing this no more with you. So quit. You've been medical cleared, so we know better. Now get in. I'm going to put you in there if you don't help us, ma'am. Just turn around, walk back. Turn around.
Oh my God.
Walk.
Oh my God.
62, can you be in route to 41?
Yeah, 41. I don't know if she's faking it or what, but she's not answering me. Wake up! Hey!
Lisa Edwards, weak and gasping for air, was escorted off a flight after a medical emergency left her fighting for her life. She was rushed to the hospital, desperate for the care she needed. But instead of finding help, what she encountered next was a series of devastating choices that would lead to her death. Lisa, a stroke survivor already grappling with severe health complications, pleaded with hospital staff, struggling to breathe. Despite this, she was dismissed, not once, but twice. The hospital, overwhelmed or indifferent, discharged her as her condition worsened. Desperate for help, Lisa refused to leave the hospital, her body failing by the minute, but no one listened. Security was called in, not to provide assistance, but to force her out. And if that wasn't enough, law enforcement stepped in next, treating her as nothing more than a nuisance. They called her a trespasser, ignored her gasping breaths, and treated her suffering with disturbing indifference. When officers arrived, Lisa tried to explain her condition, but her cries were met with cold dismissiveness. "You weren't having these breathing problems earlier when you were outside smoking a cigarette," one officer scoffed. And with that, any hope for compassion was lost. They didn't see a woman in medical crisis. They saw someone to be removed. The situation spiraled further. As the officers attempted to lift Lisa from her wheelchair and into the police cruiser, she cried out in pain, her body too weak to comply. Her struggles were seen as defiance. Dismissive remarks followed, comments like, "You need to grow up," as if her suffering were somehow her fault. Then, in an almost grotesque display of apathy, one officer sprayed Lysol in the back seat of the police vehicle, more concerned about the cleanliness of his car than the woman dying in the back. As they drove her to the detention center, Lisa's condition took a fatal turn. Her breaths became shallow, her words incoherent. By the time the officers realized how serious it was already too late. Lisa Edwards would never make it back home, but how could it come to this? How did the hospital, tasked with saving lives, and the police, sworn to protect, fail so completely? Could her life have been saved if anyone had taken her cries seriously? This video was made on the request of one of our subscribers, and if there's a specific case you'd like us to cover, let us know in the comments below. We're always open to hearing from you. Now before we continue, I'd like to ask you a small favor. Our channel is still new, and every single subscriber helps us grow. Your support motivates us to produce even more in-depth, high-quality content like this. So if you're enjoying these deep dives into medical mishaps and want to stay updated on future videos, please consider subscribing. It's a simple action that would mean the world to us and ensures you never miss out on any new cases. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. Lisa Edwards was born in 1962, and from early adulthood, she experienced several significant health issues that would shape her life trajectory. Although much of her early life has not been extensively documented, what is known about her later years centers around the severe medical challenges she faced, all of which would contribute to her ultimate vulnerability in the events leading up to her death. Edwards had a history of obesity, a medical condition that complicated many aspects of her health. Obesity is often associated with a range of comorbidities, such as cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and mobility issues, which can severely impact the quality of life. For Lisa, these health complications were exacerbated by a previous stroke, a condition that significantly impaired her motor functions. The stroke, a result of a clot or bleeding in the brain, left her partially disabled, dependent on a wheelchair for mobility. Strokes often lead to a condition known as hemiplegia, paralysis on one side of the body, and this was likely a contributing factor in her reliance on others for basic care. Further complicating her health was a fractured ankle. Edwards had suffered this injury sometime prior to February 2023, and it had not healed properly, adding to her inability to walk. The combination of her stroke and ankle fracture left her with severe mobility challenges, making even the simplest tasks, such as boarding a plane or moving around her home, difficult without assistance. As Lisa's physical condition continued to deteriorate, her respiratory health also took a hit. The lungs, which are often one of the first systems to be affected when mobility is limited, began to fail her. Breathing became a laborious task. Sedentary lifestyles, particularly for those unable to move, can cause serious respiratory issues. Fluids may build up in the lungs, breathing becomes shallow, and chronic conditions like COPD can sneak up and take hold. It's a frightening cycle. The less she could move, the worse her breathing became, and the worse her breathing became, the less she could move. But here's the heart-wrenching part of Lisa's story. Despite these obvious medical red flags, this wasn't the end of her battle. This was just the beginning of the downward spiral. Her vulnerability wasn't just physical. It was the lack of medical intervention, the oversight, the dismissal of her cries for help that would eventually lead to the tragic end of her life. February 4th, 2023 began like any other day, but for Lisa Edwards, it would mark the start of a life-threatening chain of events. Boarding a flight from Rhode Island to Tennessee, Edwards was already grappling with the weight of her medical history. Her obesity, stroke, and fractured ankle were just the tip of the iceberg. Flying, as most of us know, can be an exhausting experience even for the healthiest of people. For Lisa, it was a ticking time bomb. The harsh environment of an airplane, with its limited space, dry air, and fluctuating cabin pressure, can put anyone's body under strain. But for someone like Lisa, who had been battling respiratory issues and limited mobility, this was more than just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Her body, already weakened, had little to no capacity to withstand the added stress of air travel. And soon enough, the pressure began to build. Midway through the flight, Lisa Edwards' symptoms began to take a terrifying turn for the worse. Her breaths became shallower, her chest tighter. She was sinking into a condition known as hypoxia. For most of us, it's a word we hear about in extreme conditions, like climbing Everest or deep-sea diving. But for Lisa, it was happening thousands of feet above the ground, in the middle of a routine flight. Hypoxia, or lack of sufficient oxygen at the tissue level, can creep up quickly, especially in an environment where oxygen levels drop due to altitude changes. And Lisa's body, already burdened with years of medical problems, wasn't equipped to fight back. In these moments, panic must have set in. Her body was shutting down piece by piece. Confusion, shortness of breath, lips turning blue. Her symptoms were all too familiar for those who understand hypoxia. But for Lisa, there was no escape. Trapped in the small, confined space of the airplane, she was at the mercy of her condition. The plane finally landed in Knoxville, but by then, it was clear that Lisa needed help immediately. The clock was ticking, and her body was reaching its breaking point. Emergency medical services rushed to her side, transporting her to Blount Memorial Hospital. Yet, despite the urgency of her condition, what happened next would leave Lisa's fate in even more peril. At Blount Memorial Hospital, medical professionals sprang into action, performing a series of tests meant to diagnose and stabilize her. Pulse oximetry, the small clip that measures oxygen in your blood, likely revealed a troubling lack of oxygen circulating through her system. Perhaps a blood gas test, ABG, was ordered, showing dangerously low oxygen and carbon dioxide imbalances that confirmed her respiratory system was failing her. A chest X-ray or CT scan would have been the next logical step, checking for fluid in the lungs, pneumonia, or even signs of a potential pulmonary embolism. which could have been the cause of her sudden respiratory collapse. And with her history of stroke, her heart would have been closely monitored for signs of failure. It's important to remember, all the red flags were there. And yet, despite all these alarming indicators, Lisa was discharged the very same day. On paper, her condition might have appeared stable. Her oxygen levels could have temporarily improved, and her heart might have been beating steadily again. But beneath that superficial calm was the reality of a body teetering on the edge. This decision to send her home would become a critical mistake, one that nobody realized at the time. The hospital, perhaps due to an overload of patients or a misjudgment of the situation, made the call to discharge her, unaware that within hours, Lisa's life would spiral even further out of control. But how could such a critical error happen? How could a woman with a history as severe as Lisa's be sent back into the world without a second thought? Lisa Edwards, though discharged from Blount Memorial, was far from okay. Her body, still reeling from the earlier episode of respiratory distress, was deteriorating at a dangerous pace. Can you imagine the sheer panic that must have consumed her? Having already sought help once, only to be sent away, Lisa found herself trapped in a terrifying limbo, a ticking time bomb, where every breath felt like a struggle, and every second was a countdown to something far worse. Discharges from hospitals can often feel like a moment of relief for most patients, a sign that things are stable. But in Lisa's case, it wasn't relief. It was a temporary reprieve from the inevitable storm brewing inside her. The very act of being transported between the airport and the hospital, a physically exhausting process for someone with her fragile condition, could have exacerbated her respiratory problems. Let's take a moment to break down what this meant for Lisa. With her medical history, a stroke that had left her partially disabled, severe obesity, a fractured ankle that left her wheelchair-bound, and now, struggling to breathe, every movement was a monumental effort. Her body was not just fragile, it was failing her in real time. The physical exertion of moving from place to place, coupled with her ongoing health crisis, was like adding fuel to a fire that was already burning out of control. This is where the cracks in the system begin to show. The role of a hospital's discharge process is critical in ensuring patients continue to receive the care they need. Yet, hospitals, especially emergency rooms, are often overwhelmed, with doctors and nurses forced to make snap judgments. In cases like Lisa's, patients can sometimes fall through the cracks, deemed stable, when, in reality, their underlying conditions are like hidden landmines, ready to explode at any moment. This brings us to an essential point. Lisa's discharge wasn't just a misjudgment. It was a failure of continuity in care. Her respiratory problems weren't treated at the root. Her symptoms were merely stabilized, not addressed in full. And that gap in her care would soon become catastrophic. Recognizing that her condition wasn't improving, and feeling more unwell by the hour, Lisa made the decision to seek medical help again, this time at Fort Sanders Regional Medical Center. This move was her last-ditch effort to save herself, a desperate attempt to get the proper medical attention she so clearly needed. The very fact that she was forced to make a second trip to another hospital in a single day tells us everything we need to know about how serious her situation had become. When Lisa arrived at Fort Sanders, her body was screaming for help. She once again communicated her history, the stroke, the disability, the respiratory distress, and pleaded for a thorough assessment. Lisa's body was in acute crisis mode, and she was well aware of it. Imagine the fear coursing through her, knowing something was very, very wrong, but no one seemed to be listening. At this point, we have to wonder, what was going through the minds of the medical staff? Could they see the severity of her condition? Were they weighed down by other emergencies? Or did they simply miss the signs? For someone like Lisa, with such a complex medical history, any further delay in treatment was playing with fire. The medical team may have run the standard tests again, pulse oximetry, chest x-rays, and CT scans, possibly ruling out things like pneumonia or fluid buildup. But the real threat, the deeper, more insidious possibility of a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that could travel to the lungs, or worsening COPD, might not have been fully considered. Lisa's body was sending clear distress signals, and yet, once again, those signals went ignored. Fort Sanders became a critical turning point in Lisa's tragic story. Instead of receiving the thorough treatment she needed, her symptoms, clear and escalating, were dismissed. And with that dismissal, her chances of survival slipped even further out of reach. But why? Why wasn't she taken seriously? Why wasn't she given the immediate care her body was crying out for? Early on the morning of February 5, 2023, Lisa Edwards found herself yet again discharged from the hospital, despite her persistent complaints of shortness of breath, dizziness, and a growing sense of helplessness. However, this time she refused to leave. She was scared. Her body was telling her something was very wrong, but no one was listening. Imagine the desperation Lisa must have felt at that moment, knowing deep inside that something was gravely wrong, but instead of being treated with care, she was brushed aside. With every breath becoming a struggle and dizziness clouding her senses, Lisa refused to leave the hospital premises. She insisted that she required further medical attention. Yet, instead of recognizing her plea as a sign of urgent medical distress, hospital staff chose to escalate the situation in the worst possible way. They turned to security. Hospital security, employed by the private firm Shield and Buckler, became involved in what was quickly devolving into a tragic misunderstanding. This moment is critical. Lisa Edwards wasn't just a difficult patient. She was a woman fighting for her life. But instead of being seen as a person in desperate need of help, she was treated as a problem to be removed, a liability rather than a patient. Her refusal to leave was not defiance, it was survival. Yet security viewed her actions as non-compliance, not as the life or death plea it truly was. The empathy that should have been at the forefront of such a situation was nowhere to be found. Instead, Lisa's medical crisis became a matter of policy and procedure, and she was labeled a trespasser. It was at this point that the Knoxville Police Department, KPD, was called in to handle the situation, and the tragedy only deepened. A security guard, after referring to Lisa as a trespasser, made the fateful call to the KPD. This was not a medical emergency anymore in their eyes. This was an issue of law enforcement. The shift in focus was fatal. Instead of receiving the medical care she so urgently needed, Lisa now became the center of an escalating situation. Her health needs pushed aside, replaced by a need to remove her from the hospital grounds. As officers from the KPD arrived, including Sergeant Brandon Wardlaw, Officer Timothy DeStasio, and Officer Adam Barnett, the scene continued to unravel. Lisa, sitting in her wheelchair, was visibly struggling to breathe. Each breath was likely a battle, her chest tightening, her mind clouded by dizziness and fear. But despite her obvious distress, her words fell on deaf ears. She repeatedly informed the officers that she was in medical crisis, pleading with them to understand her condition. She mentioned her previous stroke, an event that had already left her disabled, and begged them to see that she wasn't faking or being difficult. She was begging for her life. But the officers, much like the hospital staff before them, seemed unable or unwilling to comprehend the gravity of her condition. How many times had Lisa said she couldn't breathe? How many times did she mention her stroke, her difficulty moving, her terror at what was happening to her body? And yet, her words seemed to float away, lost in the chaos of a situation that was spiraling out of control. What should have been a turning point in Lisa's favor, when officers could have stepped in to ensure she received proper medical attention, became the moment that sealed her fate. The officers didn't see a woman in distress. They saw a problem to be dealt with. Lisa's health crisis was no longer about saving her life. It was about getting her off the hospital property. How could this have happened? How could her obvious medical crisis be so misunderstood, so mishandled by everyone around her? The focus was no longer on helping her, it was on removing her. This crucial failure in recognizing a medical emergency, both by hospital staff and law enforcement, was nothing short of catastrophic. What happens next will leave you questioning how a system meant to protect the most vulnerable could fail so completely. Lisa's life was hanging by a thread, but no one was listening. As Lisa Edwards continued to plead for medical assistance, the officers present chose to interpret her distress as non-compliance rather than a legitimate health emergency. Now this is where the tragedy deepens. Body camera footage from the scene shows just how disconnected the officers were from the reality of Lisa's deteriorating condition. The footage, which captures her struggling to breathe and move, serves as a stark reminder of the deadly consequences of misunderstanding, or worse, ignoring, a medical emergency. Time and time again, Lisa made it clear that she wasn't able to walk, yet her distress was interpreted as defiance. It's as if her suffering was invisible, masked by the officers' assumptions about her behavior. Perhaps the most telling and tragic moment came when one of the officers, after witnessing her struggle, dismissed her by saying,
"We weren't having the breathing problems earlier when you're out here smoking a cigarette."
The cruelty and disregard embedded in that statement is chilling. How could anyone mistake her cries for help as anything other than a medical emergency? How could someone reduce her condition to a single moment of perceived inconsistency? This was not just a lapse in judgment. This was a fundamental failure to recognize her humanity. And then things escalated. One of the most alarming moments in the entire ordeal occurred when the officers tried to physically lift Lisa Edwards from her wheelchair and into a police cruiser. The pain was too much for her to bear. Her body, already crippled by years of medical complications, couldn't handle the rough treatment. She cried out in pain, but instead of seeing her cries as a signal to stop, they interpreted her inability to help them as resistance. This was a critical turning point. It wasn't just a failure in communication, it was a breakdown of the very system designed to protect her. Her condition visibly worsened. Her breathing became more labored, and her body became weaker. But the officers, either out of frustration or ignorance, continued their efforts to remove her, all while making dismissive comments like, "You need to grow up, and you're fine." These comments, captured on camera, are now etched in the story of Lisa Edwards' final hours. They paint a haunting picture of just how far removed the officers were from understanding the gravity of the situation. At one point, Officer Timothy DeStasio, the officer responsible for transporting Lisa, made a startling decision that demonstrated the depth of their disregard. Instead of focusing on her declining health, he sprayed Lysol in the back seat of the vehicle where Lisa sat, her life literally hanging in the balance. The act, almost symbolic in its coldness, showed just how little concern they had for her well-being. Rather than addressing her growing medical crisis, they were more worried about the cleanliness of the vehicle. And then, the unthinkable happened. After finally being placed into the back of the police cruiser, Lisa Edwards' health took a dramatic turn for the worse. Her breathing grew shallow, her responses became incoherent, and yet, the officers didn't stop. At one point, in an almost surreal twist, Officer DeStasio even made a traffic stop on the way to the detention facility, diverting his attention away from the woman who was now slipping into unconsciousness. Every second mattered, and every second was lost. By the time the officers realized something was terribly wrong, it was too late. Lisa had stopped responding altogether. Only then did they decide to take her back to Fort Sanders Regional Medical Center. But the damage had already been done. Lisa Edwards suffered a massive stroke, followed by cardiac arrest, upon arrival at the hospital. The medical staff, who had once dismissed her, tried to resuscitate her, but it was too late. Her body, worn down by years of neglect and the final hours of callous disregard, could not recover. Lisa Edwards passed away the next day, February 6, 2023. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a preventable tragedy. A life was lost not because of her medical condition alone, but because at every critical juncture, the people who were supposed to help her failed. They saw her as a problem to be managed, not a person to be saved. And in the end, that failure cost Lisa Edwards her life. In the days following Lisa Edwards' tragic death, the public response was swift and impassioned. The story of her final hours, captured on police body camera footage, quickly ignited outrage as people across the country came to grips with the harsh reality of her mistreatment. The footage offered a chilling, unfiltered look into the moments when Lisa, a woman visibly in distress, was denied the help she so desperately needed. The images and audio of her struggling to breathe, begging for assistance, painted a damning picture of the failures on multiple fronts, failures that would haunt the hospital, the Knoxville Police Department, KPD, and all involved. This was more than just a case of neglect. It was a case that exposed systemic issues in both healthcare and law enforcement. As the video spread, questions arose about how a system designed to protect people like Lisa could allow such a catastrophic breakdown in care. How could hospital staff dismiss her so easily? And how could the officers, who are meant to serve and protect, fail to recognize her life-threatening condition? Public outrage wasn't just directed at one party. It was aimed at both the hospital and the police. It became clear that Lisa Edwards' death wasn't simply a result of her stroke. It was the culmination of a series of preventable mistakes, oversights, and a complete disregard for her humanity. People demanded accountability, not just from the hospital staff who first failed her, but from the officers who treated her distress as a behavioral issue, rather than the medical emergency it was. The Knoxville Police Department quickly launched an internal investigation into the actions of the officers involved. The findings were damning. Sergeant Brandon Wardlaw, the first officer on the scene, was found to have violated 6 departmental policies. These violations included neglect of duty, unbecoming conduct, and unsatisfactory performance. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. These violations spoke to a deeper problem within the handling of vulnerable individuals in distress. As a result, Sergeant Wardlaw was demoted, a public admission of his failure to act appropriately in the situation. Officer Timothy DeStasio, the officer responsible for transporting Lisa in the police cruiser, was found to have committed 7 violations. Among these, one of the most glaring was his failure to secure Lisa properly with a seatbelt during transport. This small but crucial detail highlights the lack of care that permeated the entire situation. Lisa wasn't just a patient or a person in need of help. She was treated as an afterthought, someone to be moved from one place to another without much concern for her well-being. As punishment, DeStasio was suspended for 10 days without pay. Officer Adam Barnett, who was also on the scene, wasn't without fault either. He faced a 4-day suspension without pay for similar policy violations. Yet, despite these disciplinary actions, none of the officers involved were fired. Why weren't the consequences more severe? Many asked this question, especially in light of what had transpired, and the undeniable evidence captured on video. To further complicate matters, the medical examiner's report concluded that Lisa's death was the result of a stroke, not directly caused by the actions of the police. According to the report, the stroke occurred as a natural medical event, unrelated to her mistreatment. However, this finding didn't sit well with Lisa's family or the growing number of people following her case. Her family and supporters vehemently contested this report, arguing that while the stroke may have been the immediate cause of death, her passing was anything but natural. They pointed out that Lisa had been repeatedly begging for medical attention that, had it been given earlier, could have prevented the stroke altogether. This wasn't simply about the stroke, it was about how every step along the way, the system failed her. From the hospital that discharged her to the officers who ignored her pleas, every failure compounded the next, leading to a preventable tragedy. The outrage surrounding Lisa's death became about more than just her story. It became a rallying cry for justice for those who are vulnerable and often ignored by the system. Advocates for disability rights, civil rights organizations, and ordinary citizens demanded answers. How could a woman in such clear distress be overlooked? How many more people would need to suffer before real change was made in the way emergency situations are handled? Lisa's death brought to light the glaring gaps in both medical and law enforcement protocols, and the conversation quickly turned to reform. People were no longer just asking, "How could this happen?" They were demanding that it never happen again. On the other hand, Lisa's family filed a federal lawsuit in U.S. District Court against a range of defendants, including the officers involved, the City of Knoxville, Fort Sanders Regional Medical Center, Covenant Health, the hospital's parent company, and Shield and Buckler Security, the private security firm employed by the hospital. The lawsuit accuses these parties of wrongful death, negligence, and violations of Lisa Edwards' civil rights. The complaint highlights how Edwards' pleas for help were ignored and argues that her death was completely preventable. The lawsuit claims that her discharge from Fort Sanders was premature and that her removal by the police was unnecessary and inhumane. The legal action also includes claims under the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, EMTALA, which mandates that hospitals provide treatment to anyone experiencing a medical emergency, regardless of their ability to pay. The lawsuit contends that Fort Sanders violated this law by failing to properly assess and treat Edwards' medical emergency before discharging her. Additionally, the complaint accuses the Knoxville police of violating Edwards' Fourth Amendment rights by unlawfully arresting her and failing to provide appropriate care during her medical emergency. The public response to Lisa Edwards' case was swift and filled with outrage. Civil rights advocates, medical professionals, and disability rights groups raised concerns about the systemic failures in Edwards' case, including the mistreatment of individuals with disabilities and the mismanagement of medical emergencies by both healthcare providers and law enforcement. Knoxville Mayor India Kincannon made a public statement condemning the actions of the officers, acknowledging the failures of both the hospital and the police department in Edwards' final hours. She emphasized that no one should have been treated the way Edwards was, and pledged that the city would take steps to ensure that similar incidents would not occur in the future. As part of this effort, the Knoxville Police Department announced that all officers would undergo active bystandership for law enforcement, ABLE training, designed to prevent misconduct and encourage officers to intervene when they witness inappropriate behavior. Meanwhile, Covenant Health and Fort Sanders Regional Medical Center faced intense scrutiny, with multiple hospital security personnel either being removed from their positions or voluntarily resigning after the incident. Covenant Health declined to comment extensively on the lawsuit, citing the ongoing legal proceedings, but they emphasized that they would continue to review their protocols for handling patient discharges and emergency situations. The case of Lisa Edwards is a striking example of how systemic failures in both healthcare and law enforcement can lead to preventable tragedies. The ripple effects of her death continue to be felt in Knoxville and beyond, as her family seeks justice through their ongoing lawsuit, and the public pushes for reforms in how medical emergencies are handled by hospitals and police alike. Edwards' death has brought attention to the importance of patient advocacy, particularly for vulnerable individuals with complex medical conditions. Many critics argue that Edwards was not given the proper level of care due to a combination of misjudgment by hospital staff and lack of empathy from law enforcement officers. Her case highlights the critical role that healthcare providers and emergency services play in identifying and responding to medical emergencies, and how the failure to do so can have devastating consequences. From a legal standpoint, the federal lawsuit filed by Edwards' family seeks compensatory and punitive damages, as well as a jury trial. The family maintains that Edwards' death was avoidable, and that her rights were violated under both federal law and the U.S. Constitution. This lawsuit not only seeks justice for Lisa Edwards, but also aims to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future by holding hospitals and law enforcement accountable for their actions or inactions in medical emergencies. As of now, the legal case continues, with Edwards' family and their attorney pressing forward with claims of wrongful death, negligence, and civil rights violations. They assert that Edwards' death, far from being a natural consequence of her existing health conditions, was the result of failures on multiple levels, from the healthcare system that prematurely discharged her, to the law enforcement officers who ignored her pleas for help and failed to intervene in time to save her life. The public outcry surrounding Lisa Edwards' death has also served to amplify calls for greater transparency and accountability in both the medical and law enforcement sectors. Community organizations and civil rights groups continue to monitor the case closely, with some advocating for legislative reforms aimed at improving how emergency medical situations are handled, particularly for individuals with disabilities. In conclusion, Lisa Edwards' tragic death is a powerful reminder of the vulnerability faced by patients with complex medical conditions, especially when they fall through the cracks of systems that are meant to protect them. Her case highlights the urgent need for reform in both healthcare and law enforcement, two institutions that failed her when she needed them most. But what do you think? Could her life have been saved if anyone had taken her pleas seriously? Was it the hospital's negligence, the officer's dismissiveness, or a combination of both that sealed her fate? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you found this video insightful, and hit the bell icon to stay updated. Some of our videos haven't even hit 100 views yet, and your support means everything. It motivates us to create more and even better content. So if you want more in-depth stories like this, check out our other videos. We're just getting started.